All right. So we're in Acts chapter 21. We're actually down around verse 22 and 23, but there was something I didn't point out last time that I think is at least worthy to note. Notice how that after Paul and company, they come to Caesarea here in verse 8. They get to Caesarea, and notice Philip, he's referred to as the evangelist. Now that term, that Greek term evangelist, it's not used a whole lot, ironically, in the New Testament. But it's used here to describe Philip. It's used in Ephesians in chapter 4, where Paul's describing the fact that Jesus has established these different roles in the church to establish it, to help it, to equip it, to be able to teach the word. But notice, Philip has come to Caesarea. He's called an evangelist. What application, modern day application, that I know for a fact, I encountered in Indiana actually, that some Christians think regarding evangelists? Has anybody ever heard that evangelists shouldn't be able to actually settle somewhere? That the most that they can ever stay somewhere is 3 years, because Paul stayed in Ephesus for 3 years. And so as a result, that's the longest that we specifically know about, anybody staying and preaching. And even then, Paul was an apostle, so some people have different thoughts on that too. It's interesting because Philip, he owns a house. Presumably, it seems as if he has married, perhaps he was already married when he was in Jerusalem, but he's had 4 daughters now who have gifts of prophecy. And so he's been in Caesarea, presumably, since the events of Acts chapter 8. After he taught in the city of Samaria, after he left, he went through that region and eventually settled in Caesarea. And now he's been there that whole time. So keep in mind, in Acts chapter 9, okay, so in the end of Acts chapter 8, we see Philip going to Caesarea. Acts chapter 9, Paul is converted. Between Acts chapter 9 and Acts chapter 15, how long does Paul say it was in Galatians chapter 2? How many years? 14 years. Between the time that he was in Damascus to the time that he went down to Jerusalem to deal with the issue of circumcision, it was 14 years. And now it's been even many years after that. Okay, so you got to figure at least around 16, 18 years or so, Philip has been in Caesarea. Okay, so Philip has settled there, and he's called an evangelist. So I just kind of wanted to bring that out because that was actually something that I encountered recently. That there's some Christians that feel like evangelists are kind of journeyman type of thing, and they should constantly be journeying around and not actually staying in one spot. And I've known of preachers that they like to leave every 2 or 3 years just for whatever reason, they like that. But there's nothing in Scripture upon which you should base that to say that that's what evangelists have to do. Okay? So I wanted to make that application because we missed that last time.
Is that Philip from Acts 6? Or
Yep.
Is that Philip?
No, that's Philip.
Not the apostle?
Not the apostle.
Okay.
No, this is Philip from Acts chapter 6. Philip, one of the 7 who was assigned to take care of the Grecian widows. Yeah. Yep. All right. So anyway, I just want to mention that. Any thoughts on that before we get down into verses 22, 23? Okay. So what we ended on 3 weeks ago was actually where Paul has come to Jerusalem. He's in Jerusalem, and he gives the report of what's happening, or what had happened among the Gentiles on that 3rd journey. Okay, and this is something Paul did even after his 2nd journey. He kind of told everybody what was going on in Jerusalem. Now he's reporting this. And James, this is the brother of the Lord. Okay, James, the other James is dead at this point. So James, the brother of the Lord, and the elders in Jerusalem, presumably, I don't know why James is separate from them, whether or not he was one of the elders, but specifically this is one we would know. But James and the rest of them, they talk to Paul and they say, listen, it's being reported to the brethren that you are speaking against Moses. Primarily and specifically, speaking against the civil binding of the Mosaical law. Not the spiritual binding, because that had been done away with, but the civil binding of the Mosaical law and the traditions and the customs that went along with that man had kind of added to it, that weren't necessarily wrong, as long as they understood that this wasn't part of what God commanded. This is a tradition. Okay, traditions are fine as long as you separate what God commands versus what, something we do in association with it. Okay? So, verse 23, the elders say, "Therefore do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads and that all may know of these things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, that you yourself also walk orderly and keep the law." And that key component there is walk orderly. That is the aspect of keeping the law that they're specifying. Okay, not walking orderly as a Christian or as a Jew in relation to the spiritual applications of the law. No, this is the civil application of the law. And as we ended last class, we talked about the fact that the Mosaical law, while it had that spiritual side of it, certainly, it was guidance for an entire nation. That's different from the law of Christ. The law of Christ doesn't have direction for nations' laws and establishing how we're to function as a nation, that sort of thing. That's not in the law of Christ. That's not what it's meant to be. It is a spiritual law. And so this is what the elders have asked Paul to do. Concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided they should observe no such thing except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Specifically in Acts chapter 15, we'll remember that letter was written by the apostles, by the apostles and the elders in Jerusalem, and then it was sent by the hands of Paul and Barnabas as they went to go let everybody know in all the region of Judea. I don't know if because obviously Paul was a part of that. He was there. Okay, so he would know about that. So I don't know if they're referencing that took place, at this point, 4 or 5 years, 6 years ago maybe, or if they've actually written another letter, an additional letter or a reinforcement letter, or maybe something to remind everybody, hey, don't forget that this is what we mentioned because Judaizing teachers didn't stop. Okay, I'm sure just because of what happened in Acts 15, those individuals that are seeking to bring people back to the Jewish law, I doubt that they just stopped because, the elders in Jerusalem said that's not what we should do. So it's possible that the elders in Jerusalem had to write to multiple churches over hearing reports that, hey, this is what's happened. Well, this is what what all the apostles and elders understood from the Holy Spirit back in Acts chapter 15, but back at this point, and they are reiterating that. Either way, what we see is that this oath or this vow that Paul is to take with these 4 men, it does bear some resemblance to what we call the Nazirite vow. Okay, as I mentioned before, when we talked about the Nazirite vow, this is different than Nazarene. A lot of times people think that Jesus, because he was a Nazarene, must have taken the Nazirite vow. These are 2 completely different things. They're not related. They sound the same, but they're not. They're not related. And the Nazirite vow is mentioned in Numbers chapter 6. And so there are elements to that vow, the not allowing anything for your hair, and then after a certain amount of time you shave it and that sort of thing. Paul has done something similar, whether it was specifically the Nazirite vow or something at least similar in respect to shaving his head. He has taken vows before. Okay. Certain elements of that, okay, just because the Mosaical law has been done away with from the spiritual binding, the spiritual perspective of it, does that mean that Paul can't take these vows and follow these customs and traditions that he grew up with? As long as he, and for that matter, his example isn't teaching that this is necessary under the law of Christ, there's nothing wrong with him doing what he did. Okay, it didn't contradict the law of Christ. There was nothing about it that was contrary to any principle that was established. And this continues to be true at this point. Okay, so this isn't Paul being contradictory himself. He himself has done the same thing. And to that end, this isn't a spiritual observation. This isn't for the purpose of a necessary spiritual vow or oath required under the law of Christ. They're doing this, and well, Paul's doing this specifically, to show his support for the civil binding of the law of Moses. And actually, I wanted to read this because this is, I don't know how many people are familiar with Bob Harkrider down in Miami. Bob's put out a lot of stuff, a lot of commentaries and stuff, but he mentioned something here about this because I was trying to look up more details if we knew anything else about this vow other than the fact of number 6 in the Nazirite vow being part of it, possibly. And I wanted to read this because I thought this was a good point he makes. Paul did not sin by keeping these customs of Moses. Neither does his action give justification for others today to engage in religious practices unauthorized by God. And I hadn't thought about that angle of it. What Paul did wasn't wrong, but also this example of what Paul does doesn't all of a sudden mean, well, we can just kind of do what we want to, even though God doesn't authorize it. What Paul did was to participate in a Jewish custom, but this custom was not being enforced as essential to salvation, obviously, because it was the Mosaic law. The keeping of this vow neither compromised the faith in Christ nor violated any principle of the gospel. The vow these men had taken was probably the Nazirite vow, and Paul had earlier performed a similar action back in chapter 18. Therefore, this was not hypocritical or new and different practice. And then we see we get to verse 26, and that's one of the things that when we get to this here in verse 26, when Paul starts taking this vow, he takes them in. The next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. And one of the things that Bob says, our difficulty in applying Paul's action is that today the circumstances are altogether different when we call men to Christ. We are drawing men out of false religion, which was never ordained of God, and it would be sinful to continue to practice religious rites devised by men. But the law of Moses had not been a false religion. It was ordained by God. It simply had been replaced by a better law which provided justification. In contrast, a Gentile could not continue to practice any of the rites of idolatry, for nothing about it had been ordained by God, and the ceremonies associated with idolatry in no way honored the true God. One could not eat meat sacrificed to an idol if such action was done as a religious action, 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Similarly, when men today continue in religious practices that are not by heaven's authority, they, quote, have not God. Good intentions do not justify which is not revealed by the will of the Father. And I thought that was a great point from Bob to note the fact that the differentiation between what these men are doing, this had come from God. It's not like they just made it up and said, hey, we're going to do this. No, this had come from God. The spiritual aspect of it has been done away with. But from a civil perspective and from showing support for that civil aspect of the binding of the law for the people as a nation, there was nothing wrong with it because God gave it to them to do. So the difference between that and, as Bob mentioned today, we're calling people out of either religions that aren't doing what God wants them to do and aspects, parts of their worship, things that they're doing that were never authorized by God, or people out of, quote, idolatry, which I would kind of tend to kind of put these types of categories of people in the, atheists, people who aren't religious, people who maybe don't care about God or care about the Bible. These people kind of just serve themselves. Yourself can be an idol. Okay, we've talked about different things that can be idols. And so the same is true in that regard. And so I thought that was a great point to bring out. So any thoughts with that regard? Yes, James?
Well, there's also a difference between the sacrifices that were offered for sin, which we're no longer in for.
Yeah.
Accomplish nothing after
Sure.
Jesus offered a perfect sacrifice, and sacrifices that were made as part of a vow.
Sure.
The difference between those.
And what they were designed for, like the grain offering and so forth. Many of those offerings to God outside of the burnt offerings for sin and so forth, a lot of them were designed to honor God and to recognize what He had done. Even many of the feasts and the the days that the Jews observed. Remember, we talked about this in the Roman study, in Romans chapter 14, the observation of these days and so forth. For a Jew, he can take out the spiritual imperative or binding of it from the Mosaical law, but still observe the cultural and the civil aspect of it. There was nothing wrong with that. A Jewish Christian could continue to observe the Sabbath. Okay, that was the law, not just from a spiritual, but from a physical, civil binding perspective. And so it's, just like James mentioned, this is an understanding that because of the nature of how God delineated between that which was spiritual and that which was for sin, I mean, everything was specific. Okay, even the instruments that were used in the temple, there were specific instruments to be used at specific times and only by the priests. Okay, so everything was specific. Everything was laid out so that nobody had to guess. Nobody had to say, well, maybe God wants this and maybe God wants that. No. Well, the same is true today spiritually. God has laid out what he wants. Anything else is outside of that. But with the Mosaical law, he delineated between that which was spiritual and that which was civil. And as a result, what Paul and these men are doing isn't contradictory. It's not hypocritical. They're not showing support for the spiritual binding of the law of Moses. All right. Any thoughts through verse 26? All right. So Paul's certainly willing to do this. And of course, if you'll note, the elders, a lot of times we say it because this is a polite way to say it, the elders asked him to do it. They didn't. They told him to do it. Okay, and I think that's important to recognize as well, that just because Paul was an apostle, was he above the authority of the elders in Jerusalem? No.
Not while he was in Jerusalem.
Right. And I think that's, exactly. Not while he was in Jerusalem. Yeah, I'll make that point. Notice that they say, whoa, what happened? Notice that they say here in verse 23, therefore do what we tell you. Okay, they say, hey, Paul, if you don't, if it would be okay, or if you don't mind, would you please do this? That's not the way Luke records this. It's do this. And Paul certainly was willing to do that. Paul's not going to argue that point because he himself was in support of the civil binding of the Mosaical law. But there's certainly authority there on the elders of Jerusalem and on their part. So verse 27. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place, for they had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. Okay, so the Jews are seeing Paul. They, after these days of purification, these 4 men who were also Jews, these were not Gentiles, these were Jews and Paul, so were the 5 of them total. They're the Jews from Asia, not from Judea, okay, not from Jerusalem. The Jews from Asia saw this. And of course, the Jews from Asia have a beef against Paul anyway. Okay, the Jews do regardless, but the Jews from Asia especially. I mean, these are the ones of Antioch, of Derbe, of Lystra, Iconium, that just ran Paul out of everywhere he went. All right, he was stoned by these people at one point. So notice how men of Israel help. So they're getting the attention of the Jerusalem Jews. Hey guys, let us draw your attention to Paul here, and they're stirring everybody up because they see him in the temple. Okay? Doesn't mention the other 4 guys. I presume that they're there too, because after all, this is the part of the vow. And notice the 7 days were almost ended. It wasn't done yet. Okay? So Paul's there in the temple with these 4 men. This was a process that they have taken. This was something Paul had done for 7 days. Whether these Jews deliberately waited until the end of those 7 days, or just happened to see him after those 7, as it was getting close to the end. Either way, this is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people. Notice the accusations against the people, the law, and this place, and oh yeah, by the way. So there are 4 accusations that they level against Paul. One, they accuse him of speaking against the people. What does that mean, that he speaks against the people? Presumably, who are the people? The Jews. Okay, the Jews as a nation, as a whole. In what way could they claim? Okay, let's presume for a moment, and I hate to give them this much credit, but let's presume for a moment they weren't just making stuff up. Okay, it could very well be. But if Paul had said anything, taught anything that we know he taught, was there anything that he could have taught that they could have perceived as speaking against the people? There's one major definition that I think that they could probably, that they would draw, they of all people would certainly draw from Paul's teaching. Yeah. The Jews are the people of God. And not only that, but being even more specific, remember how the Jew thought that they were the representation, they were the fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. We are the seeds of Abraham. We are the means by which all the nations of the earth will be blessed. That's how they interpreted the promise. Paul taught, as Christ, the law of Christ presents, that Christ is the fulfillment of the law. And as Paul points out in Galatians, thank you. Yes, Galatians chapter 3. Yep, I was Colossians, Ephesians. There's that other one. Where's that? Galatians chapter 3. Well, for that matter, even into chapter 4. Describing the fulfillment of that promise from Abraham and how that this wasn't to seeds as a plural, but to seed as in Christ, singular. And then all those who are part of Christ are then blessed because they are a part of that seed. Okay, so yeah, this spiritual aspect of the people of God are no longer one nation or one ethnicity or one group of people. It's now a spiritual nation, and even Gentiles can be a part of the people of God. Okay, and not having anything to do with circumcision or obedience to the law of Moses either. Okay, they don't just become a Jew. No, Jew and Gentiles both are in the same boat now. So in that perspective, I could see how someone could twist those words of Paul, and even as a Jew who doesn't believe, I could see that being their take from that. So you're basically teaching against the people. Okay, I can see how that they would accuse Paul of that. So he speaks against the law, teaches against the law. Yes, he did, but and I say against the law, that's not really accurate. Okay, what did Paul teach regarding the spiritual aspect of the Mosaical law? Did he teach against it? He taught the fulfillment of it. Okay, to say he was against it, that's not entirely accurate. He was for it while he was a Jew. Okay, and he would have been for it had Christ not come yet. All right, Christ brought the end to that law and the introduction of the new law, the law of Christ. So I wouldn't say Paul was teaching against it as much as he was saying it's been fulfilled, it's been done away with. Now we have this, and there is a difference there. Now, how that's perceived by the Jews when Paul says you shouldn't offer sacrifices anymore, the application of that concept, I can see how they would accuse him of that. But that's still not accurate. Then he says, and this place. What place? The temple. Yeah. Not just Jerusalem, although Jerusalem might be part of it too. Jerusalem was regarded as a holy city. Okay, Jerusalem is mentioned throughout the Old Testament, Psalms, and describing Mount Zion and the fulfillment of the prophecies coming out of Zion and so forth. Okay, so Jerusalem has its place in that in the law as a holy place. So I could see that as yeah, there's an application of it as being all of Jerusalem. Certainly, Paul would have taught that it doesn't matter where you are. You know, it doesn't matter what city you're in. Cities don't matter anymore, okay, in terms of their importance under the law of Christ, law of God. But specifically, okay, especially given the Jews' penchant for, you know, we think back to Acts chapter 7 with Stephen. Stephen mentioned that about the temple. God does not dwell in temples made with hands. That particular aspect of the law was important, not just because of the Jews, but also because of the Gentiles. Why was it the people wanted a temple to start with? You remember? Why was it that the Israelites wanted to build the temple to begin with? Everybody else has one. This was a common thing. They saw the same thing with their kings. We want a king because everybody else has one. Then you've got the temple. Well, everybody, all these other have temples to their gods. We should have a temple to ours. Even though God never said, build me temple, until David says, hey, I'm going to build you a temple. So this aspect of having temples, this is important. This is where their God is. This is where they worship him. And keep in mind, the temple in and of itself had almost become an idol for the Jews. Okay, this represented God. This is where God is. So certainly Paul would have taught against the importance of the temple, especially given the fact the old law has been done away with. All right? So certainly those three aspects, I can see them perceiving or twisting Paul's words to make the accusations they make. They're not accurate. It's a misappropriation, I think, to put it in the terms that they did, but they're still accusing him of it, and Paul's going to address it here in the next chapter. So any thoughts through those first three? Okay. So those three, they can speak from experience because they likely, all of them were there. Okay, they heard Paul preach these things, or they've heard reports from their friends in the other cities of Asia and Achaia and Macedonia about what Paul was teaching. So they have a basis upon which they say the things that they say for these first three. But then this last one, he says, furthermore, he has brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled the holy place. So they assumed that because Trophimus is one of his traveling companions, they noticed they didn't see him in the temple. They saw them together in the city. So then when they saw Paul there, and since Paul, after all, speaks against the people, he speaks against the law, and he speaks against the holy place, Paul has no regard whatsoever for us. They assume that Paul just brought Trophimus into the holy place because he doesn't care. He doesn't care anymore. Why not defile the holy place? It doesn't mean anything. So they made that assumption. All right, so first of all, what overarching application can we make just from that for our personal lives?
Don't make assumptions.
Don't make assumptions. Okay? What they should have done is say, hey, Paul, you know what? And really, they baseless to even speculate. But what they could have done is say, hey, Paul, we see Trophimus with you. You didn't bring Trophimus in the temple, did you? No, of course not. Okay. And that's all it would have taken. Okay, something like that in our individual lives. And these aren't even kind of closely related either. Okay? I think they're tying it into, given the fact that Paul sees the Mosaical law as gone, that Paul doesn't care, therefore he must have brought Trophimus into the temple. But even still, these are still kind of disparate situations. They're really drawing a really long line here, and I'm not entirely certain they're being honest either. I mean, obviously they're not honest, but they're... I'm not even necessarily certain that they're being, what's the best way to put it, forthright in that assumption. Like maybe they're deliberately misconstruing it to make the accusation. They know full well that Paul never would have brought them into the temple, but they're going to say it anyway because why not? So certainly there's an application for us regarding not making assumptions. Judge not according to appearance, but according to righteous judgment. Okay, that is a very important phrase that we should live by, is that things are not always what they appear. James, go ahead.
Well, it seems to me it wouldn't have been that much of a leap for Paul to do that.
Sure. I mean, if you look at Paul the way they did.
Yeah, he understood. I mean, it's the natural conclusion of what he had taught, the gospel. By the gospel, the Gentiles are just as acceptable to God as Jews. You no longer have to become a Jew to have access to God.
Right.
So they would have had a right to go into the temple had the temple still been what it always was.
Sure. Which makes an interesting point, James. So what weren't the Jews recognizing about Paul? So if that's the case, in which we know it is the case, Paul knows that the temple doesn't mean anything anymore. Why wouldn't he take Trophimus into the temple? What would stop him? What would prevent him from doing that? Other than just irritating people.
This very thing happened.
Okay, well, yeah, there's that.
People losing influence or whatever.
Sure, sure.
Or
Yep, there's the example of it that would have a negative influence. What else, given the context of the situation, would also be a part of that? And this is something I don't think the Jews really understood or delineated between. Remember, we've talked before about the spiritual binding of the law and the civil binding of the law? Just because the temple has no more spiritual bearing, was it still part of the civil aspect of the law of the Jews? Were there still aspects of the tribe of Levi and the offerings that were given? And I mean, do you think that the civil aspect of the law just wouldn't have cared about what Paul did? I tend to think that Paul, yeah, certainly because of the influence and so forth, but the manner of even taking the spiritual value of the temple out of it. You have the binding attribute of the civil law, the binding attribute of the customs and traditions of the Jews. Paul's not going to do that. Okay, Paul's not going to do that, not just because of the influence, but because it's a binding characteristic of the civil nature of the law. And that's one thing I don't think the Jews routinely were able to separate. When they saw the law for them as a people of God, end of story. There was no difference between the spiritual and the civil. It was all one thing to them. But I tend to think this is another example of Paul. Well, certainly, I mean, Paul wouldn't have done it anyway. Even without all that, just as Doug said, he's not going to cause trouble like that anyway. But, having said that, I think this is maybe another example of that application of the difference between the spiritual and physical aspects of the law. All right? Any thoughts through this so far? Verse 29. Yes, sir.
It's pretty clear, I think, that Paul had gone back to Jerusalem in the hopes of using this opportunity
Yeah.
to convince a lot of otherwise unconvinced Jews.
Yeah.
And to just rub their face in the fact that, oh, y'all are no longer the chosen people, would not have accomplished this purpose.
No.
This might have been his last opportunity, as he saw it,
Yeah.
to preach in Jerusalem.
Right.
So,
Right.
as Doug said, no.
And that brings up an interesting point. Why were the Jews of Asia here to start with? Why are they in Jerusalem?
Keep the feast.
Okay. And remember, after the actual feast, how long did they stay? You remember? They stayed until what day? Pentecost. Okay. Penta represents how many? 50. Okay, they stayed 50 days after Passover until the waving of the first fruits by the priests on Pentecost. Okay, that represented the end of that holy period of time. And remember, Paul, he was rushing to get to Jerusalem for Pentecost. This was important to him to be there. And so he wanted to take this opportunity, and I'm guessing that at the end of this vow, because this was the first thing that he was told to do when he got to Jerusalem. So he didn't really have a lot of time yet to get into addressing the people and so forth. So I'm sure the first thing he wanted to do after he was done with this vow and so forth was try to talk to the Jews of the dispersion. Jews that maybe he hadn't gotten around to being able to speak to. Okay, keep in mind that the areas that Paul had been didn't represent all of the areas where the Jews were. Okay, I mean, we know for a fact, Paul hadn't been to Rome yet. There were other places that probably maybe hadn't even been taught the gospel yet, that Paul hasn't gotten to, or any other apostle hadn't gotten to. And so this was an opportunity. And so for this to happen, Paul's not going to do it on purpose just to make everybody upset and angry and turn them off from obeying the gospel. Yeah. Anything else through verse 29? All right. So they presumed that Paul had brought him in. Of course, he hadn't. All the city was disturbed, verse 30, and the people ran together, seized Paul, and dragged him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. He's literally in the temple. I don't know where those other 4 brethren are, whether they're there with him or they're in a different room somewhere in the temple. I'm not sure what all happened. It doesn't say that they took them too. Their focus was on Paul, okay? They take Paul, they drag him out of the temple, and then they shut the doors of the temple to prevent, because this is a major thing going on. And depending on, I remember reading something about the temple doors and how that, generally speaking, they were never shut. Okay, the shutting of the doors was an important aspect of what they're doing here. This was a big deal for them to shut the doors of the temple, especially in the midst of the day. Okay, that we're there in the day, and Paul's there at the temple performing a vow. Who knows who else was also in the temple? It wasn't just Paul. Surely there were other Jews there also performing vows, praying, sacrifices, so forth. And they shut the doors. They basically, closed business, hung the close sign up because of all this stuff that's going on. This is a big deal. And so in verse 31, as they were seeking to kill him, news came to the commander of the garrison that all of Jerusalem was in an uproar. So keep in the back of your mind. I should have had I have a schematic of the city of Jerusalem and the temple and Antonia, the fortress, the base, if you will, of the Roman garrison that was in Jerusalem, and how that Jerusalem. So the Antonia is kind of separate from the city. Okay, it's within the walls, but it's up kind of out of the way a little bit, so as to not really draw much attention to it. Yet at the same time, it's there up high, next to kind of close to the temple, where they can still be seen. All right, now I'll make sure for next class to have a schematic so I can show you what I'm talking about. So, but the fact that, it's not like they were right there down Main Street and all the city's in an uproar and they hear it. No, that's not happening. It has to be reported to the commander. Hey, there's some stuff happening. Stuff is going down. You might want to find out what's going on. He immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. So they're seeking to kill him. I'm not sure if that means they're seeking permission from Rome to do so, or if they're saying, all right, now how should we do this? In terms of, we don't care what Rome says, we're killing them anyway. I'm not sure which. Remember Stephen, did they stop and say, hey, let's go ask Rome if we can kill Stephen? No, they took him out and they stoned him. All right, so I'm not sure if the seeking to kill him was representative. Keep in mind, they're all angry. It's an uproar. Okay, whether or not they were to the point of stopping their ears and gnashing their teeth, as with Stephen, I'm not sure. But one thing's for sure, one way or another, Paul was probably going to die had the commander not gone out there, because they're beating him. Okay, they're beating Paul, and that's something that sometimes gets in this account. Sometimes you can accidentally skip over that, and not really think about what's happening to Paul during all of this. Okay, I would think that had the commander not come, they would have beaten him to death. If not beaten him, then taken out of the city and stoned him. I don't. After Jesus was crucified, the Jews seemed to have less and less patience with having to seek the authority of the Romans. Okay, and that certainly was a part of the kind of socio-political situation that was deteriorating between the Jews and Rome anyway. Okay, they didn't like having to take their orders from Rome. They didn't like having to get permission from Rome. And that was something, so you saw that with Stephen. They didn't get permission from Rome. I don't think in this case that's what they were trying to do. All right, they wanted to kill him. What's the best way for us to do this? How can we keep Rome from finding out about it? Maybe that might have been part of it too. But regardless, they're beating him. Here comes the commander. And notice then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. So notice, who is this man? What did he do? And some among the multitude cried one thing and some another. They don't even know. Okay, the Jews from Asia accused him of 4 things. Whether or not everybody was yelling one of these 4 things, or maybe some people, remember kind of like what happened at Ephesus, nobody knew what was going on, but everybody was upset. Not sure why, but we're upset. Okay. Same thing might be happening in Jerusalem, where the people who were around with the Jews of Asia, they heard what they said, which got the initial hubbub started. But then the rest of the city, they may not know why, but we're mad, we're angry. And so we're going to, they may have been saying things that weren't even a part of the original accusations. I don't know, it doesn't say. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. Presumably the 2 chains, what how are those two chains? What's with the two chains? How are those being used? Huh? Yep, one's in the hands and probably around his back and feet. Okay, so he can't run away. He can't, try to wrestle his way out of it. Okay, he's stuck. All right, so that's what the two chains are. Then in verse 35, when he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob, for the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him." I had always taken this before as being because so pressing up against everybody, it was hard for the Romans to actually extricate him from the mob. Okay, so they had to carry him. And that may very well be true. Here lately, I've been wondering if maybe some of this may also have to do with the fact that he'd been beaten. Okay, and so the violence of the mob. That's specifically. I don't think they're beating on the Roman soldiers. If the mob is being violent in the midst of the Roman soldiers, Rome didn't have a lot of patience with that type of thing. Okay, so the way it's phrased, the violence of the mob, I tend to think that was the violence towards Paul before the Romans showed up. So, and he wasn't able to. I mean, he was hurt. Likely he was bleeding. Maybe he was in pain. Whatever. I don't know what all was going on, but it was difficult for Paul to actually be taken into it. Of course, his legs would have been able to walk, but he wouldn't have been able to run, take strides. But it sounds as if, he's hurting, and certainly the mob is pressing on them. I'm not diminishing that in any way. But it says, the multitude of the people followed after them, crying out, "Away with him." These are not happy people. Okay, and this is the attitude of a people that would have killed Paul had the centurion not showed up. All right, ending through verse 36. Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. Would what they're doing, would that have been an acceptable thing under the law of Moses?
No.
Do this in the temple?
Right, and of course they had taken. They entered the temple to take him out in the midst of a vow of an oath. So just the process of going into the temple, first of all, was what they did would have been contrary to law. But then to be beating him and not have, what was one thing that all great civilizations, all civilizations, as far as I can remember, have always had in terms of law, okay, especially from a civil perspective, due process. Okay, due process. Even the law of Moses, it had within it trial, right? If somebody is accused of something, they're to be tried before they're taken and killed.
That didn't mean they didn't torture them.
Sure.
And that's what, to get the truth.
Yeah,
Speak the truth.
right. But did they do that with Stephen? Were they going to do that with Paul? No. So lawless hands, okay, and that's something the Jews, and again, the majority, I'm not saying all the Jews were like this, because obviously not all of them were, but the majority of the Jews, they cared about the law as long as it applied and supported what they wanted to do. But when their emotions played a large part, when emotions got riled and so forth, the law didn't matter. By lawless hands, they took Jesus. By lawless hands, they killed Stephen. And by lawless hands, they took Paul and were about to kill him too. Yeah. So ironic, given the fact that Paul's showing his support of the Mosaical law, the civil aspect of the Mosaical law, compared to the Jews here in this text who don't have aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing regarding the spiritual or civil aspect of the Mosaical law. Anything else through verse 36? All right. So, verse 37, when Paul was being led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" And he said, "Can you speak Greek?" It sounds as if Paul, remember these Roman soldiers, the majority of them would not have been educated. They would not know how to speak Hebrew. So I'm guessing that when Paul spoke to the Roman commander, he spoke in Greek. Okay, so when he responded, "Can you speak Greek?" I don't think he's asking, I think he's surprised. It's kind of you're speaking Greek? Aren't you that Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion, led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? Aren't you this fella, this who stirred up this trouble and was trying to cause a riot and overthrow everything? Aren't you this fella? I guess this guy assumed that's who he was. But he was surprised that Paul was speaking Greek. Again, most of the Jews would speak Aramaic. Okay, certainly they understood Hebrew, but Greek, that would have been something specific to the Jews of the dispersion and maybe the educated Jews. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up here. We're almost done here in chapter 21. We'll pick up with chapter 22 next week. The notes are on the back table if you haven't picked those up for chapter 22 and chapter 23. Thank you.